Although no one knows exactly what the metaverse will be, it's already clear our personal and professional lives will increasingly be lived in immersive, continuous, and communal virtual spaces. Our shift from physical to virtual interactions dates back to the earliest days of smoke signals, mail, the telegraph, phone, and the internet. But the COVID-19 lockdowns rapidly pushed most of us into far more intimate and significant virtual lives. While some people may have once thought our lives could be divided into the realms of virtual and real, this transition, accelerated by the pandemic, has shown us that our lives are lived in both physical and virtual spaces, which together constitute our reality. Just like the early fantasies of an open internet liberating the world have given way to authoritarian governments using internet tools to control their populations, so too might the code of the metaverse be written to oppress. Corporations and governments might feel incentivized to abuse our privacy, manipulate our actions, and limit our freedoms. But the future of the metaverse is not yet determined, and the difference between these utopian and dystopian futures is still up for grabs, and in many ways up to us. Our actions now will largely determine whether the metaverse develops in ways that serve our individual and collective needs or undermine them, expand our human possibilities or limit them, strengthen our societies or subvert them. That's why we must now begin a process for establishing preliminary core principles that can guide our efforts building a metaverse optimized for the common good. We at One Shared World, along with our collaborator 92NY, are working toward the first Constitutional Congress for the metaverse. This ongoing, decentralized, and inclusive process will be designed to give voice to people of all backgrounds across the globe and users of all major existing platforms. Join us. I'm Jamie Metzel, founder of One Shared World and a member of the advisory board of 92NY's Belfer Center for Innovation and Social Impact. On behalf of both of our organizations, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to our conversation today entitled, Do We Need a Constitution for the Metaverse? This program is both part of One Shared World's Rise or Fall Together series and of 92NY's Newmark Civic Life series. Imagine how history could have been different and possibly even better if in the earliest days of the industrial, nuclear, or internet revolutions, we'd come together for an inclusive public dialogue about what principles should guide those epic transformations. Perhaps such a process could have helped us prevent some of the worst abuses and secure a better future. Today, we're in the early days of a revolution that will have profound implications for how and where we live our lives. Although the metaverse remains an abstract idea, still only a potential, it's already clear that we'll be living ever more of our lives in immersive, continuous virtual spaces. We've all seen the movies like Ready Player One and The Matrix depicting one possible future of a metaverse, but what the metaverse or metaverses will be is not yet determined. In many ways, it's up to us to imagine and help build the kind of virtual spaces we would like to inhabit. But who is us? There's an argument to be made that in our capitalist society, we should just sit back and let companies build out the metaverse, and that we should wait until that happens before burdening this process with too much conversation about the rights and responsibilities of future metaverse inhabitants. I believe that argument is wrong. The time to explore how we can help build a metaverse optimized for the common good is now, when the early design and architectural decisions are still being made, not a decade or two from now when those foundations are already laid. Our charge for today's conversation and beyond is to explore how we can best do that. Our One Shared World Constitutional Congress for the Metaverse initiative, in close collaboration with 92NY, which we are in the early stages of developing, rests on 4 pillars. First, we will hold and encourage others to hold engaged public conversations like this one exploring issues of rights and responsibilities in the metaverse. Second, we will host and encourage others to host stakeholder consultations, bringing together companies, governments, civil society leaders, activists, and others to explore collective and inclusive ways forward. Third, we will work with other organizations toward hosting not the first Constitutional Congress for the Metaverse, designed to begin articulating what public rights and responsibilities for the metaverse might include. The goal will not be to come up with a final and determinative set of principles, but to spark an ongoing, inclusive, and decentralized process that can grow and change over time as more voices are heard. Fourth, we will call on those building future metaverses to incorporate these perspectives and principles into design and architectural decisions being made today, even in these early days. This is a very ambitious journey, which must, of course, begin with small steps. And I am delighted we have such an incredible group of discussants with us today. If you're joining on your screen, we hope you will be part of this process as well. We'll be circulating a link to the live stream chat to crowdsource your ideas for the future of the metaverse. Please click the link in the chat to add your voice to this important conversation. We also hope you'll sign up to be part of this initiative by filling out the form and providing your contact information at oneshared.world/metaverse. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce our moderator for today's event. Brittan Heller is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensic Research Lab, who advises tech companies, investors, and governments on public safety and freedom of expression. Brittan, over to you.
Thank you again, Jamie, from One Shared World, and to 92nd Street Y for co-hosting this event. I'm Brittan Heller. I'm honored to be guiding this important conversation on the future of democracy in the metaverse. Before we begin, I wanted to take a moment to introduce our panel joining us from across the United States and around the world. Philip Rosedale is a web pioneer and creator of the virtual world's Second Life, an open-ended and pioneering metaverse. This year, Philip rejoined Second Life as a strategic advisor focused on helping to shape and build a better metaverse. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you.
Next, we have Dave Waslen, Metaverse CEO of Wilder World and founder of Accretive, a tech investment and advisory practice. His expertise lies in discovering and building out next-generation technology platforms with a focus on decentralized open protocols. He's based out of Singapore. Dave, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
And next we have Gayatri Khandhadai, the digital and human rights and policy expert at the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. She's a lawyer with a background in international law and human rights, and an expert on regulating and adopting a human rights-based approach to internet governance. She's joining us from Mauritius. Gaia, thank you for coming here today. And with that, let's begin our conversation. I wanted to start off with a little bit of a warning for some of our panelists, when our panelists and our audience, when we're talking about representation and the internet, sometimes we can get into deep discussions about some of the harms that we find across this world. So I wanted to flag that for people as a trigger warning, because some of the topics that we discuss may make people feel uncomfortable. But we are doing this in the service of creating a better metaverse and the next generation of technology. So why don't we start by talking about the basic question on people's minds. What is the metaverse? When we talk about it, it seems like many people have different conceptions. So kind of getting down to brass tacks, when somebody talks to you about the metaverse, how do you explain it to them?
Brittan, can I jump in?
Go right ahead.
I think that when people today talk about metaverse, they're talking about two different, pretty easy to understand changes that can be somewhat separated from each other. The first change is taking the internet in at least many of its forms from two-dimensional to three-dimensional. So going from flat screens and images and text to something that we could wander around in, something that feels like a place, something that is three-dimensional. If you imagine something like shopping, you can certainly imagine things for which shopping would be more easily done in 3 dimensions. So 2D to 3D is thing number one. The second thing, though, and this is the more material one and the one that really brings us more here today, taking the internet from being a lonely solo experience to being a live experience. You know, when you're on a website, you might be there with 1,000 other people looking at the same page, but you can't turn and look at them or talk to them. And so I think the big thing that we're all thinking about, and I think some of us hoping, is that we can find a way to make the internet something where there are other people. And making it live is the thing that I think, you know, creates so much possibility for both great things and for harm.
Dave, do you have any thoughts? As you've been a world builder and an investor, when someone comes to you with a metaverse, what do they mean?
Yeah, I think of it like an online network of virtual worlds, and as Phil said, it's about connection and interaction. Sometimes I think the metaverse can represent games. You know, games are interacting with other people, and I actually think some of these games can be of various types. They can be 3-dimensional and sometimes even 2-dimensional. But if you have your own avatar, your own profile, you're connecting with other people either in a game or conversation, that can represent the metaverse. And then it's the interconnectivity between them. We're advancing the technologies and ways for these platforms to interact with each other. And I think it's about an interconnected web of worlds and games and platforms and communication platforms.
When I describe the metaverse to people, there's 2 other factors that haven't been discussed yet that I like to bring up. One is as Phil said, this is a spatial computing based network. So it's not just your laptop. It's not just your phone. It's not just just a smartwatch. It's all of these devices working in concert with each other to make a new computing environment that like Phil said, you walk through. Second is that it's pervasive. You don't turn it off. So when you walk away, the metaverse persists without you. Whereas when participating in social media and other things on the internet, when you shut your screen, the conversation ends. This is a self-sustaining universe that continues to develop whether or not a user is there or away. I also tell people to think about the metaverse as being here now. People always talk about it like it's a future thing, but if you use a smartphone and you use Instagram filters or Snapchat lenses, if you use QR codes, basically you are already part of a metaverse. So the time of the metaverse is already here. I also think of the metaverse as kind of the new space race to replace your smartphone. So it's the next generation of a computing network and how you're going to work and play and entertain yourself and hang out with friends and family and colleagues in the future. So think about all the functions that you use your phone for and how those are going to evolve with something that you would participate in a more physical, mental, and experiential way. So I mentioned a few things, but there's a couple different form factors when you talk about XR hardware. XR is a term that some people use for extended reality, which is a mix of augmented reality and virtual reality. Philip, can you describe for us what the hardware scape looks like for XR at this point?
Yeah, well, it's still early, and AR is a harder problem than VR, which is why many of us have had experiences probably with VR headsets. Very few of us have probably yet had experiences with AR devices. AR devices essentially seek to present 3-dimensional information while also allowing you to see the world around you. And so they're sort of adding to our real world additional information, where VR is the experience that we've all seen, thanks to immense amounts of advertising from Facebook, where you actually put a headset completely on your face and are 100% immersed in a new world, which you see see and hear inside there. So those are the two different form factors. The devices are very expensive in the case of AR, typically thousands of dollars for devices, hundreds of dollars for VR, and again, somewhat subsidized in the near term. They're still pretty expensive, certainly more so than smartphones. So they're not highly accessible technology yet, but the experience that's delivered over them is, qualitatively very different than that of looking at a screen, and also comes with all kinds of problems, as you know, that we spend a lot of time thinking about. Being inside a headset makes you feel like you're in a space with other people or a person in a way that is dramatically even more real than the most visceral online experiences you can have today.
Dave, would you want to add anything to kind of the hardware apparatus of what people think about when they access the metaverse?
Yeah, I mean, Phil nailed it. It's still pretty early. With us at Wilder World, we're planning to launch the world first in browser. So it's going to be on your flat screen. It's going to have the ability to log in, and then we want to migrate to mobile and then extend into these headsets that are coming out. But everyone's working in parallel. So the metaverse is software that we're building, and then other companies are building the hardware, and they're going to integrate and merge. And so it's still early, but I think that it's the point of the metaverse and the point of all these platforms is that they're interoperable. You've got choice of what you can use, and as technology advances, it's going to get less and less expensive, more and more accessible. And I think that's the goal of pretty much any business or decentralized platform, is to have the most number of people interacting and on the platform as possible. So we want to bring the barriers down as much as we can.
I think that's really interesting that your venture is focusing on in-browser experiences first, when most people will use WebXR to experience the metaverse for the first time, which I think is a very interesting statistic, because it really shows that there is a bridge between social media, gaming, email, work portals, and what's coming next.
Brittan, one thing I would add is that for those who have experienced it, that are listening and participating in the conversation here, Discord is another example of something that really kind of is a metaverse and embraces all of the problems that we're talking about here. People are joining into a public space or a somewhat public space, a Discord server, and then they're able to talk to each other and be very live with each other. And then, of course, there are all the problems that come of that, and the questions of, what would, say, a constitution change of that. But so I think it's a good framing as we're thinking about, headsets. And as you said, in many ways, this stuff is here today, and Discord's a great example of that.
So stemming off of the conversation about Discord, let's look at content and behavior in the metaverse. Is right now the conversation that we're all having is focused on governance. Who's going to make the rules for the metaverse? What will these rules look like? Who will have a say in the rules, and how will they be enforced? What are some of the ways that content online has been historically governed, and what does it look like going forward?
Maybe I can chime in a little bit to shed some light on how content online gets governed. There's been multiple research that has looked at what are the laws that have been used to deal with content online. It's essentially a mix of what would be referred to as offline regulations, for example, penal codes, and regulation that has been designed specifically to deal with digital developments. It's often a mix of these two, which has worked in some cases, which has not worked in some cases, because what happens is that there's a little bit of shopping that goes on especially when you're dealing with authoritarian states, with governments choosing the legislation that they think is perhaps harsher. There's a very interesting study that the Association for Progressive Communications did in 2017 that showcased how defamation, for example, is far more penalized when it's online than it is offline. So there are new kinds of crimes that are being defined, which let me put it this way. If that's the same kind of behavior you engaged in offline, it's probably not a crime. But if you do it online, it probably is a crime. So there are these sort of new developments that take place. So that's typically how online content moderation has happened as far as state is concerned. But companies regulate content or self-regulate content based on what they call as community standards, which is essentially something that changes. That's not a one-time agreement with the user. It sort of unilaterally can change. So there's community standards that companies stick to. It's a mix of policy and regulation, essentially.
When I think about online content moderation, I think about three different factors: actors, behaviors, and content. And when you look at Web 2, social media, that seems to be the rubric that companies used to hang their rules upon. I think when you look at the metaverse, you actually, in a 3D universe, you have different prongs. You have actors, you have behaviors, you have content, but you also have environment, because you are building the world and people are experiencing the physical environment that's created digitally as if they are sitting in their living room. So that is another aspect when you're looking at what content moderation is going to look like. I don't think about content moderation in the metaverse. I think about content and conduct moderation, because like you said, it's more like interacting with people in a public square or on the street than it is chatting with them on Twitter. Some people ask me about the laws around the metaverse. As Jamie said in his introduction, this is still an evolving concept. So the laws themselves are still evolving. When people ask me what laws do I look to, I always look to AI-based regulations coming out of the EU as kind of the future-proofing mechanism for this. Like, and one example is laws coming out of the EU make it so that you have to identify when you're interacting with AI. If that transfers over to the metaverse, it could be very interesting when you're talking about digital identities or the type of tasks that we're able to do in the metaverse and working with avatars. So there aren't a lot of things yet. There are some national commissions with looking at countries around the world, but nothing very pointed. There's only been one US court case so far that has talked about the metaverse, and it held that the Americans with Disabilities Act actually applies to digital spaces. So people are just starting to think about what the metaverse looks like, how it intersects with offline law, and what that means if we want to make things just and have spaces for everyone to participate.
You know, the example of intellectual property law being different in different places is a perfect one. In Second Life, where there's 1 million people from all over the world that are participating in a very large economy, people have, sued each other and gotten into disputes with each other, over, say, intellectual property rights many, many, many times over the years. And as you say, it's a very undetermined and unsatisfying situation today, because, what do you do when two people in two different countries, living in two different countries who have different intellectual property rights, get in a fight in a virtual world? What is the law in that case? So yeah, and that's an example of where this is all going to have to be sorted out.
I think in Second Life, what you talked about before, I wanted to ask, is there community-based moderation? How do people resolve disputes about content and conduct in that world? Yeah,
I think the reason that Second Life, and for those who don't know, I'll just say this, but please, go read scholarly articles about it if you care to. Second Life is a remarkably civil place, and it stands out as exceptional in that regard. I think the quick answer to that is, it is a very polycentric system. So where you are in Second Life is someone's or some group of people's community to whose standards and in some cases sanctions you will be subject. You can also belong to groups, people typically belong to like hundreds of different groups in Second Life. And again, those groups can have rules about conduct and behavior. So there's quite a rich set of examples there that are at least worth looking at as we think about how a future metaverse or metaverses becomes a proper civil place.
Mm-hmm. And it looks like community-based moderation schemes have been done in the gaming community traditionally, have worked on social media platforms to some extent. And I think scholars debate what that extent is, but it's very different than having a centralized moderator because, like you said, groups create their own standards and enforce them. Have you seen any other examples from other platforms or gaming communities, maybe around Asia, maybe in your role as an investor that stand out for the way that they resolve disputes online?
On this topic, I think it's important that the community does have a pretty big voice. All these platforms want a large number of users, and if it's somewhat user governed, user created, I think that's really important. It's about democratizing, and if they're the ones that are using it, they should have a say in how it's being developed and how it's governed and managed. And in the Web3 decentralized world, mm-hmm. the proximity from the team building the product and the users is really flat. It's really close. As Phil mentioned on Discord, a lot of these founders and CEOs and managers of the company are in there. They're in the weeds, chatting with the community. They get feedback directly, and I like where that's going. I think that's important. Rather than some huge long trail of customer service up to layers and layers of management up to the CEO eventually. I think it's important that there's this discussion from the grassroots people using it and the actual developers building it. I think the more decentralized it can be, the more open source and community driven. I think that's important for governance and managing these spaces.
Gaia, do you have something to add?
Sorry. Yeah. What I wanted to say was that maybe we need to kind of zoom out to get a sense of how regulation around digital developments took place, right? Especially if we look at the last 10 years, that's the period within which most of the regulations aimed at digital governance pretty much came up, especially in the global south. And you're right that the EU region especially has played a very critical role in terms of standard setting, in terms of getting ahead of or showing the way for many of the ways in which regulation could take place. And I think that when it comes to the metaverse, there are multiple things that will still apply. It's not just a kind of regulation that would apply. So you would still see, or I assume that you would still see the offline regulations applying in terms of penal laws, company-related laws, disclosure-related laws. They would still apply, I would assume. And then you would have intermediary liability-related laws that would apply. In most countries now, you have intermediary liability laws that are specifically targeting companies and how they should, go about their services. For example, the mix of the Digital Services Act, the Digital Markets Act, that will certainly have an impact on all of the companies that seek to be in that metaverse space. But I think another really important basket of laws that should, and I hopefully think does apply, would be privacy and data protection laws. That certainly should have a big space. And beyond that, hopefully we should have minority protection laws, gender-related laws, all of these should apply. So I'm sure there is a whole mix of regulations that would apply. And the challenge really with the metaverse is that, as it has been with most technological developments, and in fact, even with social media, is that a lot of the regulations that came up that were targeting these specific technologies were more or less a knee-jerk reaction in terms of responding to a situation that really got out of hand. And that's not worked out too well, because what then happens is that these laws sometimes end up being too vague or don't really serve the purpose and get used arbitrarily. We have an opportunity with the metaverse now to be able to zoom out, to try and get a good sense of what it could be, what the challenges that it could pose could possibly be, and how we could address that with the existing tools and the things that you need in addition. And the reason I'm saying that is because there's little point in reinventing the wheel, and there is already regulation that should be extended to anything online or digital.
I think that's a very important point to make, especially when we want to talk about some of the challenges that we see with digital worlds and online communities. I wanted to ask the panelists about some of the safety risks and challenges that you've heard about from users in virtual reality and augmented reality environments. For me, I hear a lot about harassment of women and minorities in public spaces. And part of the reason that this troubles me is because the way your brain processes events and interactions in virtual reality is the same as if you were creating memories. So it goes through your hippocampus. And that means when people say that they were assaulted in the metaverse, it's not like they were reading harsh words on the web. It actually, to them, experientially feels like somebody came up and accosted them and grabbed them and hurt them or sexually assaulted them. And so because of all the things that make the metaverse great, the sense of presence and immediacy, it also makes the harms particularly virulent. So for me, looking at harassment is one example. Philip, did you have any more to add?
Sure. I mean, I'm asked a lot now, although Second Life is a world that contains adults. It doesn't contain kids. Which is interesting. I'm asked and talk a lot about kids. And one of the things to agree with you, one of the things I say about VR is that if you're thinking about protecting kids, or whether you should let your kids do something online or in a virtual world, the easiest way to think about it is absolutely no different than real life. So if you would let your kid walk around on the streets of New York unaccompanied, then you could probably let them do something online. But what I always say about it is the simplest way to look at it, just as you said, Brittan, is that the experience of being next to someone and communicating with somebody in the virtual world is, under many circumstances, and certainly this is all the more true with VR headsets and whatnot, identical to encountering somebody in the real world. And so all of the same concerns, protections, and considerations need to be made. I think trying to draw a distinction and say that virtual reality, wearing a VR headset is somehow different than standing next to somebody is dumb. It's not a meaningful distinction, and it's just going to become less and less so as technology continues forward.
I think one of the important things that you brought up is youth and user authenticity issues. So there has been a lot of coverage about children venturing into areas of the metaverse where it's not PG-13, and people getting upset about the exposure of children and some of the actions of children. One of the things that I don't hear discussed a lot, but I think will be more salient in augmented reality, is issues related to impersonation-based harms. Because if we are supposed to use the metaverse to conduct e-commerce, if we're supposed to do banking and use it for statescraft and other things, there is no real authentication of identity at this point. And so how are we going to tie our digital selves to our physical selves and make it so that somebody else can't run around the metaverse and do things that harm us financially or reputationally?
With respect to Second Life, I can say that with Second Life, for a lot of reasons, we chose to very, very aggressively protect the identity. That is to say, the true names, the real life identity of those who chose to use Second Life. I could, defend tons and tons of reasons for that. But we also sought to create a civil environment in which people could meet each other in public and would get along. And we succeeded in doing that. I would say that looking forward, we're sort of having, in my opinion, we're having a conversation largely, well, we're going from an internet on which there is no identity and therefore no recourse or sanction against anyone who violates a social contract. I mean, that is, I think, one of the fundamental problems that we have today. The internet is a completely unregulated environment in which there is no sense of identity. On the other hand, if we go all the way to everyone presents as their biometrically identified, DNA specimen that they are, we have a whole nother set of problems that are equally bad. I can identify you, I can find you, I can harm your real body just knowing who you are as an avatar, et cetera, et cetera. So there's sort of different extremes. I think the right place that we're going to end up with is something where membership in groups and the sanctions and requirements of being a member of that group, of multiple groups, are likely to be a kind of a leading component of creating a good outcome here.
One thing that I like to think about is the difference between augmented reality and virtual reality, and how the different form factors of being in an immersive headset versus having a digital overlay on the real world, how these different form factors create different types of risk. If you look at some of the popular augmented reality games, like Pokemon Go or others, there's been lots of complaints about that being used as a real-time location tracker and people being harassed in real life based on their participation in augmented reality games. I've heard other discussions about these type of technologies being used as a tool to further domestic violence against people for the same reasons, where people are able to see where you are and where you're going and who you're hanging out with. So for me, looking at stalking-based harms seems more salient to augmented reality, but it's not limited to it.
I think, the number one probable problem that I can sort of foresee is the extreme loss of control. Loss of control over what you choose to share and what you choose not to share. I think that line really gets even worse with all these devices interacting between themselves. But there's also other sort of harms, especially when it comes to mental health and losing sort of your safety around these issues. I think that's a really significant harm. It's been less explored. We're only now beginning to look at the impact TikTok is having or impact Instagram is having on body images of young women. So Metaverse could possibly pose an entirely different set of problems. And then you also have environmental harms, which haven't really been talked about because of the amount of energy all of this is going to take, the number of kinds of devices that's going to be needed, the e-waste that's going to be created. So there's also an entire set of environmental harms that we haven't really looked at. I'm trying to look at these harms from the perspective of going back to what Jamie mentioned at the beginning. If we had the opportunity before the explosion of social media to step back and think about what could go wrong and try to fix it, I think we're sort of at that moment with the metaverse to try to step back and think of all the different things that it could help with and the things that could get worse.
Mm-hmm. So if we were to try to address some of these challenges with a process to bring regular people or average users into the discussion about how the metaverse would be built, what could that look like? How could we create a representative constitution for the denzians of the metaverse?
I mean, a constitution is a group of people who are coming together deciding with some affinity, right? Typically geographic, coming together to decide how they would all agree to treat each other, right? I mean, that is kind of the gist of it. And I think that's exactly the right thing to do. As the internet does become a live place, we need to have one or more groups of us saying, what are the rules by which we will behave? And then what are the mechanisms, right? What are the design that enables the mechanisms where there will be sanctions or consequences for, say, violating those rules? I mean, that's the wonderful conversation to be had.
And what Jamie was saying at the beginning, I thought was interesting when he said that it's all about building a constitution. It's not the constitution, but it's a constitution. And then, with Web3 and with technology, businesses and platforms build on each other. They see something that works and they push it the next level, and they keep building off of it. Like Phil is a pioneer and a godfather of the metaverse sector, and businesses like Wilder World are 15 years later, and we're building off of that. We're seeing what works great, and we're trying to push the envelope and build further. And so with the Constitution, it's about different groups finding what works best, and there's different games, there's different worlds, there's different purposes. Like some platforms, you won't really be interacting with avatar to avatar, so there might not be for some virtually physical barriers that might not apply as much as some other platform. And so, I think it's important that, what One World is doing with starting this conversation, if they can create something that's well-crafted, well thought through, a lot of opinions and people contributing to it, then more and more businesses and metaverses can build on that and find what works well and what's been tried and tested, and then keep pushing it from there.
Gaia, I wanted to ask you a question about the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, also known as the Ruggie principles. I'd like to know if you could explain that to us, because it really does break down the different roles that governments, that companies, and that civil society has. And so I've heard in our discussion different strengths, where we're talking about working with platforms or working with governments, or also bringing in civil society as a representative, decentralized authority. What does international law teach us about the different roles of these players to respect human rights?
Yes, so what's really interesting about trying to come up with different solutions, trying to create different permutations and combinations of people who provide perspectives on how different digital technologies should be governed, is that it brings a new voice and it brings different perspectives. But my sort of point to go back to always would be, so what is it going to be based on? And it has to be based on a human rights approach. It has to be a human rights-based approach to the development of technology, the governance of technology, and dealing with that technology. And what a human rights-based approach to technology would look like is placing the person and communities at the center of the technology, of trying to understand how human and societal life is going to be better or worse as a result of something. So a rights-based approach to technology really, and governing technology is really something that needs to come from different actors. It needs to come from the people who are developing technology, it needs to come from the state, and it also needs to, an understanding about it needs to be prevalent among users who are experiencing technology, right? So it comes at those different levels. And the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, it's a fantastic document that helps us get through and understand the human rights compliance requirements with a bit more practical guidance. So as far as the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights is concerned, the state is still the primary body that needs to protect our rights. Mm-hmm. But companies still have a responsibility to respect our rights. So essentially, the state needs to prevent these violations. Companies need to refrain from perpetrating violations. And the third pillar is that we need to have access to remedies. So, and I think that when it comes to the metaverse, the third pillar is also extremely important, is what are going to be consequences when things don't go the way they're supposed to go. Now, when we're looking at the metaverse, I think a very, very important piece that the UN Guiding Principles offers is the requirement to do due diligence. And due diligence needs to come from different actors, but the private sector, especially companies, looking at due diligence as an ongoing process is really important. To do due diligence from the moment of conception, design, throughout the life cycle of a product or technology. That's really important. And I think that a lot of problems that we could be facing with metaverse, or even the positives with metaverse, can really benefit from doing a thorough human rights and environmental due diligence that is periodic, that involves all the stakeholders that need to be there. That's really thorough, not just sort of a checklist exercise, but it really is thorough. And I think the UNGPs provides for or recommends a smart mix of regulation and policy to help us do that.
So you talked a lot about how a human rights centric approach is centered around the individual, so around the users, and that's the seed that a constitution will spring from. What do you think is how do we get that type of feedback for the metaverse? One idea that I wanted to explore is, do companies get this? Do governments get this? How do we provide our feedback and really create a type of public discussion around this idea? It's an interesting question, and I think one that we don't have to have an answer to at this point, but it's important to think about. So maybe restating it another way, what the rights of the individuals are sort of stated in principles. So I wanted to ask each one of you, what do you think would be some of the most important principles to include in a constitution for the metaverse? For me, it would be privacy. When you look around the world, privacy law is really centered on protecting someone's identity, but with the way that that data collection and storage and application works in the metaverse, it's more a concept of mental privacy, because of the inferences that you can make about somebody's body, somebody's state of mind, somebody's preferences and behavior that you can't really do on social media in the same way. So for me, it's protecting people's thoughts, which if that was violated would be as invasive as surveillance.
And perhaps for the people that are listening and thinking about this, to doubly underscore that, Brittan, I can know who you are within a few seconds of your entering a room if you're wearing a VR headset without you speaking. I can do that from your body motion. It's what's called a confident biometric. Just a few seconds of seeing your avatar come back into the room is enough for me to positively ID you. So think what a company can do if it's free to collect that information on everybody. There is no concept of cookie. There is a positive ID. Another one, which is just super important, just to restate what Brittan said, from watching your movements and listening to your voice, I can tell using AI very, very potentially destructive things about you, like whether you're depressed, whether you're paying attention, just really, really invasive things can be determined as an inevitable side effect of creating these more immersive devices that would allow us to be together. So it's just I agree with Brittan that privacy is extraordinarily important to protect. It was a pillar, has been a pillar, is a pillar of Second Life. However, on top of that, the ability to apply sanctions and establish a social contract, establish a constitution, is dependent on people also making certain other types of agreements about, say, how they know each other or how they will recognize each other. And so it is a very difficult razor's edge between those two.
Yeah, and I think what you brought up also for me, it talks about the porous interplay of identity. I believe that a Stanford study said it was 20 seconds of recorded material about you in the metaverse. And the way that you tilt your head and point is as physically identifying as your fingerprint when you're in virtual reality. You can tell things like whether somebody is sexually attracted to someone else. You can tell whether or not somebody is telling the truth, or whether or not somebody is showing preclinical signs of schizophrenia, ADHD, Parkinson's, or Huntington's. So for me, another principle related to privacy is the principle of consent, because autonomy is the undergirding for human rights around the world. And it's all about a constitution is premised on the consent of the governed. And so I don't know, I think translating concepts of meaningful informed consent into a metaverse-based environment is going to be very challenging, because that will be premised on companies being very transparent about the data they're gathering, how they're applying that data, and how that data is stored and used. I wrote about this before and called it biometric psychography. If you combine biometrics and targeted advertising, it's the like button on steroids. And I'd like to prevent that from happening.
Yeah,
I don't think you can consent to involuntary disclosure.
Yeah, I think another concept is what's the business model of the company and the platform. If it's advertising and selling your data, using that data to make sure you come back more and use it more, or I think it's documented that Facebook may show you these extreme opinions so that you're engaged, or you're really happy, or you're angry, or it just keeps you on the platform longer and longer so they can sell you more ads. But some of these Web3 and decentralized platforms, they don't have that as a business model. The business model is completely different. It's about the digital asset. It's about the currency, and people want to generate that currency by playing the game. They can earn it, or they can build in world. They can have bounties. They can be developers and earn that currency, and then they can spend it for entertainment or utility or whatever they want to spend it for. And so I think, hopefully the business model around some of these worlds as well is completely flipped, so that there's no need to breach data or sell people's data in the traditional context.
Yeah, I mean, I think a simple starting point for a constitution, literally an article in it, would be something like what you just said, Dave, that no individual shall store, transmit, share, or use information gathered about any other individual for the purpose of business, or for the purpose of anything. A good thought experiment would be, I was looking at Brittan's AirPods there. Now, imagine that Brittan's AirPods, the next version, Apple offers a really neat feature to Brittan, which they may well do. And that one is the feature that just remembers everyone she's ever run into or been near. Now, if you think about that as a thought experiment, Brittan might correctly claim that she should have such a helper stuck in her ears, so that when I walk up to her, it helps her by saying, "You saw him last in Oakland at this time or at this place." Well, that might be helpful to Brittan, but what we would probably all draw the line at, and we might all agree that it would be, given neurodivergence amongst people, right? It might actually be fair to give Brittan such a tool. But to send that data to somewhere else, or use it in a business, or send it to the cloud, I think that's the place where we would want to draw the line. So I think that would be like a thing that one might at least discuss in a constitution.
And then also transparency around this too. If this constitution needs to be transparent, these rules and rules of engagement need to be transparent, so that perhaps you can even opt in or opt out. Sometimes it might be a feature, not a bug, that those AirPods are tracking things if it's for children, for example, or for whatnot. But transparency, I think, is going to be another key thing. And hopefully it's easier to be transparent, because there's some certain platform in the metaverse, and they can have some website where you have to review it, or it's crowdsourced how it's created. And it can be posted more readily available than other platforms.
I think that's a really good point about transparency. And when I think about how transparency has translated into other constitutions, if you look at the US constitutions, I view the Bill of Rights as actually the corollary to that, where it's more of a general transparency. So what are the rules? What are the procedures we're going to use to apply those rules to you? And it's very different than saying this is the individual application of those rules. That's more like a court case. But so everybody knows what's going to happen if one of the rules is broken. Everybody knows how we make the rules. Everybody is on the same page about procedure in addition to substance. But I'm a lawyer, so I'm I'm a procedure person.
But building on what Dave said, transparency is a really important part about transparency is the rules, right? But also the practical aspect of transparency is really important. For instance, the example Philip brought up, right? If my voice is going to be recognized and is being associated with me, I have the right to know how that happened. Like, at what point was my voice captured to which device and how was it associated with me? If a piece of content is being shown to me, I should be able to figure out why that particular piece of content was recommended to me, or why was a suggestion to join a group was sent my way, or why a particular advertisement was shown to me. Transparency in terms of having access to information that or let's say decisions that were made about you or judgments that were made about you. I think that's also an important piece of transparency. But in terms of principles, there are multiple principles, but if I had to pick the most important principle for me for Metaverse would be the right to choice. For us to be able to choose which platform we are going to use, being able to move from one platform to another platform, being able to choose how much and when I can say no, and what I choose to share, what I choose not to share. I think that the right to choice is really important because it impacts sense of dignity, which I'm sure is also a really important thing, that the important value that is going to be affected by the metaverse. Because I think choice should be at the center of that.
I couldn't agree more. Before we change topics, I think choice is absolutely critical. I think Gaia, you're spot on with that. What Phil's built with Second Life, it's a choice. It's a choice to go into a different environment, different world, have an escape. Leave the traditional world and go somewhere virtual and interact with people. And that's a choice. If you want to, wherever you live in the world, you might want to choose to communicate with different people around the world or different backgrounds, different interests. And same with, people from the Web3 world, they want choice of financial currencies and being not having no choice. You have no choice with certain governments and certain platforms. So I think choice is absolutely critical as well. I want to highlight that.
Yes, the connection between autonomy and dignity.
Yeah,
and agency.
Very, very well said. For me, one last principle that I'm going to throw out, and then I'm going to turn to concluding thoughts with all three of you, is accessibility. When you look at the UN Treaty on the Rights of Disabled Persons, it actually was the only treaty that was negotiated with disabled people at the table. So with people who would be, with stakeholders of the treaty, who would be directly impacted by its formation and application. They were a part of that process. And that's unique in international law. I find that this is really important with the metaverse because a lot of the hardware was not created with diverse audiences in mind. So you can actually see how that impacts women and ethnic and religious minorities and people with apparent and non-apparent disabilities. So for me, if we really want a metaverse for all, we have to start thinking about that, not just in the worlds we create, but in the the portals and the mechanisms that we build to let people access these. And if I can't fit it over my head, or if I can't raise my arms, and that is what's needed to play the game or enter the digital bank or communicate with others, then that's an infringement of people's rights to access information as well, if we're talking about the metaverse.
And adding on to that, in late 2019, we made the very heavy decision at High Fidelity to essentially discontinue work on VR headsets as they exist today. And one of the reasons for that was that we saw a curious thing happening, which was beyond the simple problems like Brittan is talking about, such as the distance between your eyes, potentially, if, for example, you're female versus male, being too narrow for the projection screens on the Quest, for example, to be able to serve you. A more subtle and kind of damning thing we saw was that your willingness to put on a VR headset, which is essentially a blindfold, is proportionate to the degree to which you feel safe wearing a blindfold in a room with other people. And what we saw, of course, was that creates a very striking bias in the behavior of the people willing to wear VR devices. And so, that's an example of just a terrible problem related to accessibility and inclusion that, in our case, because we were trying to build an open, social, inclusive environments like Second Life is, made us actually give up on VR headsets in their current form altogether.
And another layer of exclusion is simply the fact that a significant portion of the global south is not yet connected to the internet. Right. There's still a damning digital divide. And the digital divide is not just in terms of being able to get on the internet, but there's also gender-related digital divide in terms of how much of the internet I can actually use with autonomy. So with all of that, adding metaverse in and kind of looking at digital solutions as the only way forward would require ICT infrastructure, would require a lot of leveling off, without which we're only going to make worse the gaps that exist in society.
We have a few minutes remaining, and so with the last 3 minutes, I'm going to ask each one of you for your concluding thoughts. What stood out for you in this discussion as the most important points, or what are the points you think need more discussion so we can figure out how to represent the views of everyone in the metaverse? Dave, do you want to start?
Sure. I really think it's about transparency and platforms being built from the ground up, from the community. Really close proximity from the community to the upper management, building the technology, and building these rules and regulations with the community, with their actual input, voting on things and submitting proposals. I think it's about, the community crafting these things, making it democratic, and then being transparent and open about it.
That's great. Gaia, would you like to go next?
Yes, for me, the interesting part about the entire discussion is that the fact remains that no company or a tech developer sits down and thinks of, okay, let me think of ways to make someone's life more miserable. That's definitely not the angle that anybody takes. Yeah. But there are outcomes, and then there are outcomes. So I think the gap really is in terms of having principled approaches, human rights approaches to developing technology, and not waiting till it's too late. If we stick to the mindset of let's see how this plays out, it's never going to play out the way that you think it's going to play out. So we do need to have a principled approach to regulating. But I think the most important shift of mindset really needs to be from let's break things to we need to think of how to build things further and more stronger, and so everybody can find ways to benefit from it.
And Philip, let's give you the final thought.
Well, I'd like to conclude. We've talked a lot about challenges, problems, dangers, and I'd like to conclude kind of with a message of hope on this. Human beings as social creatures are the most polite, the most compassionate, the most generous when we are face to face. This is something that we saw big time in Second Life. We had forums in those early days that were text forums, like what we've had forever on the internet and which have caused so much trouble, Reddit kind of thing. And people would be mean to each other in those forums. And I would go in world and I would get face to face with them and get them together as avatars. And they would immediately apologize and find common ground. That is a common human trait, though it may not happen all the time. It happens statistically the great majority of the time for us. So if we are able to make the internet more live, and if we are able to find constitutions and forge ways of getting along with each other in there, which I know we can, we will achieve something that I think many of us, myself included, having started my career in 1994 or so, the beginning of the internet, we will find ourselves with the situation that a lot of us had always hoped for, which is a genuine way to connect intimately in a present way with people far across the world from us and like them and get along with them and find common ground with them. So, let me just hold out that I feel certain that we can go there. There's great danger that we don't, but we certainly can.
That's wonderful. Thank you all for being here with me today and for talking about principles and social compacts and how we can create a better metaverse. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have. So I wanted to thank our incredible panel for joining us and sharing their expertise and insight. Thank you to the 92nd Street Y, New York, and to One Shared World for convening and launching this initiative. Please remember to click the link in the chat and fill out a brief form and survey telling us what you think is critical for the future of the metaverse. I'm Brittan Heller. Thank you very much and good night.